You've just survived. Barely. The man to your left didn't. The man to your right is still screaming somewhere behind you. But somehow, you made it through the shield wall, through the arrows, through the chaos that turns a human being into nothing more than meat and instinct. Your shoulder is open to the bone. Your contubernium, the 8 men who share your tent, your bread, your life, they're dragging you now, half carrying you. You can feel the warmth of your own blood soaking through your tunic, and then you see it. The Valetudinarium, the medical tent. And approaching from inside, a man in a simple tunic, carrying a wooden case of iron instruments. You try to get up. You tell your brothers to put you down. You would rather crawl back to the battlefield and walk through that entrance. Because you know what happens in there. You've heard the sounds. These are Roman soldiers. Men who charged war elephants. Men who held their ground against Carthaginian cavalry and Germanic berserkers. Men trained since boyhood to look death square in the face and spit. So why were Roman soldiers? Men trained to face death without flinching, absolutely terrified of their own doctors. The answer is more disturbing than you think. Picture a craftsman's workshop, iron tools hanging from wooden pegs, hooks in various sizes, long-handled probes, blades. Something that looks disturbingly like a corkscrew. Now picture that same workshop inside a military camp and understand that everything you're looking at is going into a human body. The Roman military physician, the medicus, carried a case of instruments that, to modern eyes, are almost indistinguishable from torture devices. The speculum ani, a 3-pronged dilator used to open body cavities for internal inspection, was inserted without lubrication, without comfort, without mercy. The vulsella, long-handled grasping forceps, were used to reach inside wounds and seize fragments of iron arrowheads, sometimes gripping not just the metal, but the shreds of tissue around it. The terebra, a hand-cranked bone drill, looked precisely like what it was. Then there was the bone saw. The Romans called it the cerula. Archaeologists have recovered examples from Pompeii dating to the 1st century AD. And they are virtually identical to amputation saws used in European field surgery as late as the American Civil War. The design barely needed improving, which tells you something about how efficiently it did what it did. For anesthesia, and we use that word generously, a soldier might be given wine, large amounts of wine. Some physicians used henbane, a plant with mild sedative properties known to the Romans as hyoscyamus. The 1st century physician Dioscorides noted its sleep-inducing qualities in his pharmacological text. What he did not note was that the dose difference between sedation and death was uncomfortably small. The Roman writer Celsus, writing in his encyclopedic work De Medicina around 25 AD, described the ideal surgeon as a man who should have a strong and steady hand which never trembles, and be no less ready to use the left hand as the right, with vision sharp and clear and spirit undaunted, filled with pity so as to wish to cure his patient, yet not moved by his cries. He wasn't describing compassion. He was describing a man who could operate on a screaming, conscious human being without losing focus, because that was the job, but the tools were just the beginning. Here is the thing about Roman medicine that changes everything. They were working in complete darkness about the most fundamental fact of surgery. They had no concept of infection. Not a flawed concept, not a partially correct one, no concept at all. Bacteria wouldn't be discovered until Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through a microscope in 1676, 16 centuries after the height of Roman military power. Until then, no one on earth understood why wounds sometimes healed cleanly and sometimes turned men into corpses within days. The prevailing theory was miasma, bad air. The idea held by physicians from Hippocrates through Galen was that disease arose from corrupted, foul-smelling vapors emanating from swamps, rotting organic matter, and the bodies of the dead. It was why Roman camps were built on elevated ground where possible, why latrines were placed downwind. Genuinely sensible architectural instincts, but for entirely the wrong reasons. What this meant in practice was that a Roman surgeon might operate on 20 men in succession using the same instruments, never washing his hands between patients, wiping his probes on a cloth that had already absorbed the wound fluid of the men before them, not out of cruelty, out of ignorance, out of a cosmology that had no place for the invisible. The Valetudinarium, the Roman military hospital, was in many ways a marvel of organization. We have archaeological evidence of hospitals at the legionary fortresses of Novisium in Germania and Inchtuthil in Scotland, purpose-built rectangular structures with individual recovery wards, ventilation corridors, and dedicated surgical rooms. They were the most sophisticated military medical facilities in the ancient world. They were also unwittingly extraordinarily efficient infection factories. During the Dacian Wars of 101-102 AD and 105-106 AD, Emperor Trajan's campaigns against Decebalus's kingdom involved brutal siege warfare in difficult mountain terrain. The Column of Trajan, erected in 113 AD in Rome, famously depicts Roman field medics, the capsulae, bandaging soldiers in the midst of combat. Historians estimate that in those campaigns, disease and post-wound infection killed substantially more Roman soldiers than Dacian weapons ever did. Men who fought their way through the Danube crossing and the mountain passes of Dacia came home to die in a hospital bed in a fortress on the Rhine, killed by something no Roman general could see, name, or fight. Soldiers learned this. Word traveled through the legions the way all information does in an army, fast, brutal, and exaggerated just enough to become legend. You went into the Valetudinarium with a wound in your arm. You came out a month later with no arm, or you didn't come out at all. After a while, men started making calculations, and some of them started hiding. There were 3 procedures above all others that Roman soldiers dreaded. 3 procedures that could make a man who'd fought for 20 years go white at the mention of them. We're going to walk through each one slowly. The first was arrow and projectile removal. An iron arrowhead, the kind fired by Parthian horse archers, by Germanic bowmen, by Dacian warriors, didn't enter a body cleanly. It tumbled, it fragmented. The barbed designs common in the 2nd century AD were engineered so that pulling the shaft back out would tear the wound wider than the entry point. Roman surgeons knew this. Their solution was to make the wound even larger. Using the Valsella forceps, or thin iron probes called chiathiscomy, the medicus would insert instruments into the wound channel and open it, cutting or tearing surrounding tissue to create a clear path to the arrowhead. Then they would seize the head and pull. If the head had broken from the shaft and lodged near bone, the process could take an hour. The patient was conscious for all of it. Some accounts suggest soldiers bit through leather straps. Some simply screamed until they lost consciousness. The surgeon worked regardless. The second procedure was amputation. Roman military surgeons developed a technique that, purely in terms of speed, was extraordinary. A skilled medicus could amputate a lower leg in under 3 minutes. 3 minutes. This was not gentleness. This was practice. The limb was cut above the wound site, the bone sawed through, while 4 assistants, soldiers detailed to the hospital, held the patient down by his shoulders, his remaining leg, and his torso. A 5th man often held the head still. The stump was then cauterized with a red-hot iron to seal blood vessels, a process described by Celsus as producing a smell the surgeon must learn to ignore. There was no bone saw that didn't vibrate. There was no cut that didn't pull. The leather was there to bite on. Not because it helped, it didn't, but because it kept the patient from biting through his own tongue when the bone gave way. The third procedure was trepanation. If you took a blow to the head from a mace, a stone, a thrown pilum, or a shield rim, the bone could crack inward, a depressed fracture pressing against the brain, causing swelling, seizures, loss of consciousness. The Roman solution, inherited from Greek medicine and documented by Galen in the 2nd century AD, was to drill through the skull. The terebra, the hand-cranked drill, was placed against the skull and turned. The surgeon would stop frequently, probing the depth with a thin iron pin, trying to feel the moment the bone was through, without plunging into brain matter. Soldiers who survived trepanation described the vibration as a sound that existed inside the skull itself, a grinding that they could hear but not locate. Some accounts, filtered through later medical writers, describe men asking to be killed during the procedure. Some describe surgeons pressing on through the screaming. We know trepanation worked sometimes. Archaeologists have recovered Roman-era skulls showing healed trepanation wounds, the bone growing back around the drill hole, proof of survival, which makes it, in its own horrifying way, one of ancient medicine's genuine successes. It did not feel like a success to the man on the table. The Romans kept meticulous records. Papyrus documents recovered from the Egyptian military garrison at Bun Gem and from Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall give us extraordinary insight into daily military administration. Rations, duties, disciplinary reports, sick lists. And those sick lists are revealing. There are records of men listed as wounded who were never brought to the Valetudinarium. Men who returned to duty before any physician examined them. Men who, according to their century's records, simply refused. This wasn't cowardice. Roman military law was not lenient with cowards, and refusing a direct order in a legion was a dangerous business. These were men making a rational calculation. The odds of surviving untreated, with a wound they could manage themselves, were better than the odds of surviving treatment. Self-cauterization was not uncommon. A soldier who'd seen enough battlefield medicine knew how to heat an iron in a campfire and press it against a wound to seal it. It was excruciating. It left monstrous scars. It also didn't involve anyone drilling into your skull or probing your arm cavity for an hour while 4 men sat on your chest. Consider what this tells you. These men marched 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, in full lorica segmentata, carrying 60 pounds of equipment in summer heat. They charged into formations of men who wanted to kill them. They crossed rivers on makeshift bridges under arrow fire. They dug fortifications by hand after 12-hour marches. The Roman legion was, by any measure in the ancient world, perhaps the most psychologically and physically hardened military force in history. And they hid in their tents to avoid the doctor. There's something almost darkly funny about it, if you let yourself see it that way. The most powerful army in the world, whose soldiers ate danger for breakfast and marched through it, undone by a man in a tunic carrying a wooden case. But the humor evaporates quickly when you remember what was in the case. What keeps these men from being entirely broken by this fear is what comes next. Because for all its horrors, Roman military medicine was doing something no one else in the ancient world had figured out how to do. Here is the twist. Roman soldiers had a higher survival rate from battlefield wounds than virtually any other ancient army. Not because Roman medicine was good by our standards, because by the standards of their world, it was revolutionary. They cleaned wounds with vinegar. No idea why it worked. They thought it removed bad humors. What they'd stumbled onto was acetic acid, which is genuinely antibacterial. They were saving lives with a mechanism they couldn't name. The Valetudinarium system placed purpose-built hospitals at every major fortress by the 1st century AD. Patients in separate rooms, ventilation built into the architecture, diet and rest treated as medicine, not luxury. Dioscorides, a Greek physician who marched with Nero's armies, compiled the De Materia Medica, 600 medicinal substances cataloged in a single text that remained the standard pharmaceutical reference for 1,500 years after Rome fell, and every century of 80 men had a dedicated capsarius. The moment you went down, someone trained to save you was already moving. Roman soldiers feared their doctors. They were also more likely to survive because of them. History rarely gives you a cleaner paradox than that.